Welcome everyone and good afternoon. As COP26 continues in Glasgow this week, we're delighted that you've taken the time to join us for this conversation about our duties and our obligations to children and to future generations. For those who are new to our work, CAPITA is an independent, nonpartisan think tank. Our purpose is to build a future in which all children and families flourish. While COP26 is a moment for urgent action, it is also an opportunity for moral and ethical reflection. And it is that reflection that we hope to foster by hosting this conversation today. The short biographies of our speakers are on the event page, and I would imagine that it is their expertise and perspective that has drawn you here today. So we will not take the time to rehearse their qualifications. They are immense. I am delighted instead to turn the conversation directly over to our friend and moderator for today, Cecilia Baca Jones, Executive Director of the Bernard Van Leeuwen Foundation. Cece?
Thank you, Joe. I'm thrilled to be part of this panel and to moderate such a great conversation that we're going to have with Veronica, Kat, and Liz. So I really just want to enjoy the time of reflecting together and really try to have a conversation that will allow us to think about why do we need to put children at the center of the climate conversations and how we can really prioritize climate justice for the next generations. So let me kick off this conversation with Veronica. And Veronica, I'm going to start right away asking a question that I think would be very insightful from the work that you do. But I really want to see what is your answer to what can we learn from trees and forests? Can you tell us more about this thinking?
Sure. Thanks, Cecilia, for the question. So yes, it might sound like an odd question to get started on, but a lot has been written about recently in relation to trees and forests, and there's been a lot of misconceptions for a long time about trees. And in fact, what we now know is that trees are organized, they collaborate, they thrive when they are diverse, they think intergenerationally as well. And so there's a lot that we can learn in our relationship with, children and working with children. So, being more collaborative, for example, is something that we should really prioritize. And so thinking more in terms of solidarity. So not just thinking about your child or your immediate family, but thinking much more beyond. And trees don't just support their offspring, they support all other species, and they thrive in diversity as well. So you're never going to have just one little family of trees. You're going to have different species, you're going to have fungi, you're going to have all kinds of trees. The more diverse they are, the more they thrive. The more diverse, the more they thrive, the better they are prepared for the future, and the better they are able to deal with the challenges that they are facing. And they also work cross-generationally, meaning that they don't just protect their offspring, but they also think about, okay, as the little trees grow, what is my role as an elder? So that's something else that we also need to do some work on in terms of working cross-generationally, because we tend to be very organized in age groups. So these are just some initial thoughts on trees, our ancestors.
Thank you, Veronica. This resonates a lot with me. I come from Ecuador, and Ecuador in 2008 actually approved it in its constitution, the rights to nature. Indeed. And what you're saying right now makes a lot of sense to me, because in reality, if we started seeing like trees and forests as an active asset that also has the rights to survive and to basically be considered as living things around us, maybe the whole system would be different. But let's move on. And Liz, I'm curious to see, do you think we are obliged to combat climate change for today's children and for future generations? Do you think this is an obligation in a world, as basically Veronica was saying, in a world of great diversity, of ethical diversity, religious diversity, but with so many different traditions? Do you think there's an obligation towards this?
Morally speaking, yes, I do. And actually, I think it's I think it's morally pretty basic. I mean, I think we can think about this in two ways, right? We can think about the obligations that we have just as human beings to the next generation, and we can think about the responsibilities that we have as parents. And if we think about morality, if we strip away the kind of political polarization that there's been about this debate, actually it comes down to really uncontroversial moral principles. I mean, climate change is killing people, and it will continue to do so. This is really serious harm, and the responsibility not to do serious harm or to protect people from it, these are pretty much the most basic principles that we have, morally speaking, and they're principles that I think we could agree on more or less whatever our religious or political perspective. So I think actually it's important to remember that the morality is in some ways as uncontroversial here as the science. I mean, it's clear that there's consensus on the science, and I think actually the ethics is also very clear here. But another way we can think about it is, look, these are our own children. So I'm speaking as a parent. We have duties that we owe our own children. We have responsibilities because we brought them into the world. We made commitments to them. And if we're going to take seriously protecting these vulnerable people whom we love, then we have to take seriously protecting them from this huge threat. I mean, otherwise, to use a slightly overused analogy, we're essentially reading bedtime stories in a house that's burning down if we're doing all these other things for our children and not trying to protect them from climate change. So yes, I think there is this moral obligation, definitely.
And Liz, maybe just to emphasize on this, do you think this moral obligation or this ethics can help like bridging divides? Is this what you're basically saying?
I think yes, it can. I mean, I think it's become, and it's been in many ways sort of cleverly polarized as a debate by some vested interests. But essentially, yes, I think it does come down to the kind of basic morality that most people would share. And I think especially if we focus on this idea of our own children, because the love that we have for our own children is something that's so incredibly widely shared that I think thinking about this as parents is something which can potentially be very widely motivating and can, I hope, bridge divides.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. I think the Bernard Van Leer Foundation works on early childhood development. And we do find that working on this field is usually a topic and field that can bridge divides. Because I think everybody in a society is basically interested in protecting children's rights. And this basically leads me to a very nice question to you, Kat, because I'm interested in knowing, can the institution of children's rights legislation actually damage the dignity of children and hinder their flourishing? Because I know you have some experience of work in Sierra Leone, and I wonder if you could share with all of us what happened there, and when children's rights legislation was implemented, what happened? What were you able to observe there?
So this was a fascinating case where we see the sort of the non-universality of rights, but the universality of responsibilities in ways that we don't necessarily understand to be true. So the emphasis on rights being an emphasis that stems from an idea of individual autonomy, and that individuals on their own have an existence in this world that needs to be recognized and promoted. And the rights doctrine kind of does a job of promoting what individuals are owed in the present and in the future, but it doesn't really speak about who is it that owes this and how it is that it comes into being. And in Sierra Leone, parenting is considered a sort of collective responsibility, and children are the responsibility of the collective, and children are also responsible to the collective. So that when you leave your home as a child in the morning, whether you're going to school or to play or to run errands, you know that all of the parents in the neighborhood or in the village are kind of watching you and looking out for you, but you're also responsible in your behavior to all of those parents because everyone's eyes are watching everyone. And This also meant that before child rights legislation, children could be taken care of collectively. And so, if their parents' crops failed that year, for example, that the child would still get all the food that they needed because they could be fed by other parents in the village. That if they were away from home during a mealtime, that they would be fed by the parents of the village wherever they were. And so children were essentially the collective in the village, and parenting also existed the same way. Now, when child rights legislation came in, the emphasis on individual autonomy also meant an emphasis on individual responsibility. And so this meant that the legal emphasis turned to one where individual parents were responsible only for their own children and not others. And the consequences of this were that if a child did not get food, if a child was not in school, if a child was goofing off somewhere, that their own parents were legally responsible for this and not any other parents, nor could parents actually look after, discipline, or punish anyone else's children. For example, it was essentially rendered illegal for a non-parent adult to break up a fight between children that they were not related to. And you can imagine the kinds of chaos that this created. So it actually created a resurgence of, of children getting injured, children getting sick, children not in school, and their parents being hauled in front of police officers because they were not fulfilling their responsibilities towards their own children. When in fact, what was happening is that because parents were so afraid of these legal ramifications of the law that they would no longer kind of look out for other people's children. And that if they had to reserve food for only their own children, they also would not feed other people's children. And so the nutritional status of children started to decline after child rights legislation was introduced in 2007, just as sort of, child fights and child injuries and children actually not being looked after also increased because the responsibility was essentially recentered only within the child's own home and their parents. And so it really goes back to Veronica's, idea of the trees and this idea of a collective and this idea of solidarity, is that when everyone is your responsibility and you are everyone's responsibility, everyone is lifted by this. When we devolve those responsibilities upon to individuals and extremely small family units, we actually damage the ability of the collective to thrive.
I love this last point because it really makes you think, there's always this saying that says you need a community to raise a child or you need a city to raise a child. And I truly think in most cases it's true, right? But I'm wondering, and maybe let's just go back to one common question to you all. Do you actually think that parents have a special duty to mitigate climate change? And can you be more specific? I think, Liz, you already referred to this. But I wonder if we could have like a conversation around this. How can parents have a special duty on mitigating climate change? And how can you see parents do this in a very concrete and specific, using a very concrete or specific example?
So I think that's a great question, and it also actually ties really well with ideas I was just having listening there to Catherine, because yes, I think so. I think it follows from what I was saying before, that if we take seriously our responsibility as parents to protect our children, we have to protect them or seek to protect them from this really major threat that they are facing through climate change. And that is going to involve mitigation as well as adaptation, partly because if we don't mitigate climate change, if we just try and sort of protect our own children through adaptation, we're not going to be protecting their children, and that will be fundamentally important to them as well. But I think it's also really important to stress that this isn't something that any individual parent can do on their own. And I think this brings us back really well to the trees example and to the points Kat was making, because this is a case where we can say, well, look, we owe certain things to our own children, but we can actually only do it by working together. So we have this situation where we have to think collectively. We have to think about, well, how can we organize? How can we try and change the system that we're working within? How can we try and challenge the laws, challenge the societal norms that are causing this problem? And how can we do this collectively? So I think as sort of what we should be doing in terms of individual parents is really thinking about how we can work with each other and work together in terms of becoming activists, challenging norms on climate change, fighting for political change. And so I do think that we have this special duty, but it's a kind of collective special duty in a sense, because it's a special duty that none of us can actually fulfill on our own.
Veronica or Kat, do you have any additional thoughts on this? Because I think it's interesting to see this collective duty. How does it come to a very concrete example of how can this be done?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think Liz's point is really important, that it's not just the responsibility of the parents. I mean, I think, you know, I suppose what parents or educators or carers or anyone really can do is to also think, you know, what are the skills that children need to face the world that is, you know, before us, I think. And it's not really something we think about in the education system. You know, we think they need a good education or a degree and then everything will be fine. But we know now that that's no longer the case. And so what are those skills that are needed? And maybe, you know, those skills are solidarity, managing uncertainty, you know, these sorts of things. I think, you know, we look at, you know, children and young people today who are in the streets and they're angry, and, you know, some of them are actually the product of us overly protecting them, right? We don't, you know, and so suddenly, you know, the adults or they're young teenagers and they have access to information and they're like, hold on a minute, what is this world you're giving me now? We've been kind of shielding them. We haven't necessarily given them the skills to see the world clearly, right? They see it through all of these lenses and our own biases and, you know, fairy tale stories. And so they you know, suddenly they see this kind of scary world and they haven't necessarily been taught how to deal with their own fear either. So I think there's also those human elements that we need to think about. How do we, you know, we're not going to stop climate change, are we? But we can think about, okay, how can we be clear on what is happening? How can we see clearly so that we can, you know, act wisely, I guess?
I think it's also important to kind of expand our understanding of parenting, and that, you know, anyone's children are all our children and thus all our responsibility. And I think this is another thing, you know, again, going back to this example of rights, that the danger we face is in reifying this as to whose responsibility precisely it is, what kind of collective that is. And there's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of emphasis on getting, you know, the nations who are the biggest polluters to commit the most, or, you know, the oil companies. And there's this idea of who it is that bears the largest brunt of the blame, rather than who it is that can actually do the greatest amount of good. Who is it whose decisions can actually, you know, affect this change? And I read an article just the other day that a majority of people polled by the Guardian newspaper said that they were unwilling to make adjustments to their lifestyle in order to mitigate climate change. And this is the kind of thing where the most good could actually be done without kind of relying on a couple of people in the abstract to sort of do the right thing. And the inverse of this is also in, you know, expanding this idea of parenting and responsibilities is also not kind of leaving it only to those who believe that they have the right as physical parents of children to make the decisions for the next generation. And this came across in the strangest way in American politics recently when J.D. Vance, who is the author of Hillbilly Elegy, which is his autobiography about growing up poor in Appalachia, is running for political office in the US. And he actually said that legislators who do not have children should not be allowed to vote on any legislation that has to do with the future, because they are not physically invested in such a project. And I think, you know, as horrifying as that might seem, it actually, you know, brings to light a really important point about this idea of responsibility and what an investment in the future actually looks like in cultivating that investment, and thus who are the parents of the future.
I love this last point, Kat, and it makes me think because I think on one side we need to work on creating this awareness, and as I think Liz was saying, how can we just like try to have more parents become like activists in this topic? But I'm also thinking, how can we help those who are actually responsible for the well-being of children? And you were talking about somebody working in Congress or like building all the legal frameworks. But I'm thinking, how can we help those who are in general responsible for the politics around children and future generations to be more attuned to the risks of climate change? Can you think of any specific examples of what we can do? Because I think, Veronica, you were talking about what can we do in order to build different skills on children, and how can we embed this new way of parenting where we're basically trying to have more resilient children, accept the world they're going to have to live with, and probably confront many of the fears that they will have to live with. But is there anything that we can do in order to make those who are responsible for making the new politics or policies, in order to really make them more aware and of the risks that children might be facing? Can you think of any ideas of what this can represent? And please, anyone jump in.
I'll jump in. I mean, it's a great question. In a way, because I work for a not-for-profit organization, I feel like I should speak about what I think we should do in our sector. And, you know, I mean, coming back to, you know, what you were talking about, Kat, in relation to the human rights, I don't think that the problem is with human rights. The problem is with how we've communicated them, with how we've interpreted them, with how we've made them an NGO program, or with, you know, if we look at the kind of the original text of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you know, it's not so different to trees, right? Interdependence, universal, and all of these values. The problem, I think, is we haven't been able to communicate it in a language that encompasses everything. And in a way, and this is why sometimes there's the friction where people say human rights are Western, are a Western concept. I think it's the way it's been communicated perhaps as a Western idea. And a lot of it has been, unfortunately, siloed, which is where we end up with a lot of focus on those individual rights, but those individual rights cannot be removed from the collective rights. But in most of the work of NGOs, there's been a much more emphasis on those individual rights, or perhaps they're just louder, and it's often been removed from the collective rights, which is why we end up with this kind of my child needs the best education, and who cares about the others, or whatever. And that's why rights is getting a bad rep in a way, when actually the fundamental concept is in line with, you know, how the trees operate. And also it should also be seen as one element, right? It's only one element. It's one avenue for campaigning. It's one avenue for action. It's not the only one. And so, you know, I guess for me, one of the things that is really, really important is that we rethink, you know, how we tell stories, how we use the language, and who we communicate with, to kind of overcome some of this, you know, some of the kind of negativity and, you know, and fights, and people going, you're in the human rights camp, you're in the development camp, and all of this kind of polarization that is just wasting everyone's time, you know. So that's what I think is one of the really important, crucial element, is language.
If I could just come in there, I think it's really important that this idea of rights isn't lost in, as you say, the way that the sort of language sometimes gets used and caught up to defend anything, essentially all kinds of different ways of life. Because when we think about climate change, we are talking about rights which are fundamental, they're basic. I mean, we're talking about things like the right to life, we're talking about the right to health. So it can be used, you know, I have the right to drive my SUV, or to do whatever else I want to do, is a very different claim from the claim, look, my child or my potential grandchild has a right to breathe clean air. I mean, these are very, very different kinds of uses of the term right, and we're talking about really basic moral rights here in order to make the argument. The other thing I wanted to say was just touching on the Guardian article that Kat referred to, because I think that was a really interesting survey, and it kind of brings out why I think what's most important here, the first thing to focus on as a parent is trying to change what happens collectively. Because of course, lots of people, if they're asked, would you change your lifestyle? Would you give up your car or whatever, are going to think, oh no, that would be really difficult for me to do. But actually, if political and legal and social changes were made so that public transport was better, just to give one example, and more affordable, these changes would become possible for all different families. So I think it becomes that's a good example of the reason why I think it's important that we make lifestyle changes as families. But the most important thing I think that we should be focusing on, parents, is being activists in a very broad sense. And there are some really great examples of parent activist groups. Things like Our Kids Climate, for example, have been very active at this COP, have been gathering together a petition on keeping fossil fuels in the ground, for example, and presenting that, and have also done work with some of the big insurance companies, for example, pushing them as parents, sort of really targeting on the fact that some of those senior management are parents, and pointing out that it's something that they owe to their children as well. So I think there's a lot that can be done in that activism space by parents.
I think it also kind of circles back to one of the fundamental phrasings in the Convention on the Rights of the Child that we often forget about, which is that it comes up in multiple iterations of rights, that we're thinking in terms of the best interests of children. And it seems to me that so much of what is happening right now doesn't actually consider the best interests of children at all, or also who it is that determines what those best interests are. And that right now it's banks and international negotiators who are determining what's in the best interest of the child, rather than thinking in terms of, the children have something to say. We have the Sunrise Movement, which was started by teenagers. It didn't have the right to vote, and they're kind of moving in that direction. And clearly they were raised in a space where asking these hard questions and kind of taking action was possible, to Liz's point about activist parents, and that activist parents create activist children. We see the same in peace studies. There's an organization called Global Unites, which was essentially started by one teenager out of Sri Lanka who was trying to kind of bring other teenagers together to stop the interethnic conflict in Sri Lanka, knowing that the young people, the youth, had a much more vested interest, that this was in their own best interest to stop the conflict, because they were the ones who were living with the long-term consequences of this. And now this young leader is in his late 30s, and he said, we're now a generational movement because we are raising our children in this movement. We are raising our children to be aware, to be activists, to stop violence happening in their own spaces that we learned as children. And so this idea of youth as a generational concern, it's always been very slippery in peace studies to think about how to incorporate young people into global platforms of activism. But what it really is kind of setting a firm foundation for this to be a generational concern. And for this idea of the best interests of children to also emanate from children themselves, who are aware actors in the world around them and can also pass on these concerns to future generations.
I think that's super important. I think the role, the sort of participatory role that young people have been playing in really taking a leadership role in climate activism is massively important. I mean, it's really interesting morally as well, because in a way it's a sort of injustice that our generation have done them, an extra injustice that they're having to do this. But it's also the case that given how much they have at stake, they have this kind of participatory entitlement to be part of the decision-making process. I mean, it just seems appalling that young people who are often articulate and extraordinarily well informed on these challenges that they face, that they don't even have a vote, so they're kind of seeking out other ways of having their political voice. And I think it's really important that as parents we sort of support them and try and reinforce their voice.
And just talking about this and how we can make the most of parents who decide to become activists or advocates for advocating for the consequences of climate change in children. What would be your advice in order to do this? Because we've talked about the importance of empowering young children, but how do we give young children a voice? And I'm also thinking sometimes, for example, from the work that we do, of course, working with the early years, it's impossible to give a voice to babies who are suffering, for example, from air pollution from the minute they're born. But I'm thinking, okay, so if we cannot get those very young voices, how can we really empower parents in becoming more effective on the advocate work that they do? What would you advise different movements or different young children, young people who are basically committing to this cause? Any advice?
So I think there's, sorry, no, you go ahead.
I just wanted to jump on what you said, Liz, and talk a little bit more about that. I mean, I feel like we're putting a lot of responsibility on parents' shoulders, and you know, and there's always a risk with. There tends to be a sort of risk of making, you know, environmental issues an individual thing to do, right? I'm going to recycle. Well, we're not going to recycle our way out of this mess, are we? And so again, I mean, of course, parents have responsibilities, but we have to take it to the power holders, right? And so, you know, yes, us as NGOs, we can, you know, include children voices in our work, etc., and we try and do that, and we try and get better at it. Absolutely essential, but it has to happen at the institutional level. And so, to go back to what Liz was saying, we should start by giving them the vote. I mean, there's no protective reason why we shouldn't. I mean, in my other organization, CRIN, you know, we argue that they should be given the vote from the age at which they can decide whether they want to vote. And so usually that will be, you know, 6 or 7 when they learn to read and write, or perhaps earlier, perhaps later. That is the age at which they should be allowed to decide whether they want to vote. But as, you know, and of course, you know, not that we've seen in many countries, one vote doesn't really, you know, make us active citizens, but it's one way to start. And by doing that, other institutions will also have to change the language that they use, because suddenly, you know, children are also going to have a vote, and children are going to be a lot less forgiving to politicians who just, you know, go, oh yes, sorry, I didn't do this last time because this. They're going to be a lot more impatient. And so the language will change, and the focus of a lot of institutions. But then we have to look at other institutions and how are children's views taken into account at all levels, you know, everything that concerns them, where the traffic, you know, how traffic is moving through cities. Actually, we shouldn't have traffic in cities at all. But, you know, we need to think about all of the ways that children should have a say in everything that affects them. And it shouldn't be one program by an academic institution or a not-for-profit. It needs to be mainstreamed into society. That, I mean, to me, I think the institutional and the power holders is really, really crucial. Otherwise, it's too much responsibility for parents.
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, this can't just be done by parents. It has to be a collective effort. I mean, I think there's a lot that parents can do, and I think there's a sort of real power that parents have if parents act collectively, because there are so many of them. They're such powerful consumer body. There are a large proportion of voters, for example. But of course, it can't be and shouldn't just be parents. I completely agree, and I think it's really, there's also a really important and interesting balance that has to be struck between involving children and hearing their voices and giving them scope to enjoy their childhood, to be children. And so it is this really difficult balancing act, and it's going to depend kind of crucially to some extent on the age of the child. And of course that's going to vary a bit from child to child, what age is the right age, but there's a huge difference between, you know, your incredibly well-informed 13-year-old who might well know much more about climate change than their parents do, and you know, a 3-year-old, and there is a sort of a balance between informing them and empowering them and not scaring them too early. And I think that's really difficult for parents and for institutions to do, but it's something that we do have to take really seriously in meeting these challenges. I mean, personally, I take my children on climate marches and have done since they were quite young, and talk to them about climate change, but in relatively unscary terms so far, insofar as you can talk about climate change in an unscary way, but just building it up gradually and trying to involve them in the sort of campaign for change at the same time as they become aware of the challenge, which I hope will be a way of trying to limit the degree to which they feel kind of overpowered and terrified by this threat.
I think it's also really important for parents to recognize that empowering children to action is one of the best ways to bolster their mental health at this moment. And Greta Thunberg being the best example of this. She was in a deep depression as a child, as a 13-year-old, when she came to full grips with the climate crisis. And it was her parents saying, you can do a school strike on Fridays, if this is what brings you out of this state. And, helped her essentially address her mental health by doing the only action that she thoughtfully considered would make any difference. And we see the results of that. But basically, I think it's really important to focus on the fact that empowering children basically gives them both the landscape, the support, and the tools to help themselves, as well as the legitimacy to do so. Much better than saying, oh, no, you can't do this because you can't miss school, or, you have to live according to the rules because I said so, because that's clearly what's gotten us into this mess. And so, trusting our children that, skipping school for a day to go on a climate march, or expending all of their energy on, a climate club at school, or getting their university to divest, that, these aren't extracurriculars, and they're not hobbies, and they're not taking time away from the things that they should be doing. These are the things that our children are doing for themselves, and we need to support them in all ways that we can.
And this links very nicely to a question that we have from Tim Gill, and who is basically interested to hear how adults can support the effective participation, empowerment of children in responding to the climate crisis. And he's asking, what are the most compelling examples that the panel can share? And maybe I actually would like to share an example, because I think it's really interesting to think about which are the true ways to empower children. And I remember some work that was done in Iquitos in Peru. And the problem there was the polluted water and the number of children that were dying because they didn't know how to swim. And it suddenly became like the main cause for children to organize at very early stages. And it was the elderly siblings of the younger children that they were like basically engaged in learning how to swim, so they could then teach their little brothers and sisters how to swim. And I'm sharing this experience because I think it's a very powerful one, because I've seen many different movements around children and teenagers not necessarily reflect their real causes or concerns. And my advice to Team's question would be, we really need to make sure that whatever kind of movement or that we are supporting around children can really represent the interest of children, the authentic interest of children, that can be very different in many different regions around the world. So I think the example of Sierra Leone was excellent, because that represents a very specific reality in one very specific geographic area. But as this example, we might have many different examples. But for me, the most important thing when you're working with young children and giving them and enforcing and empowering them to be or bring their own voices out, I think it's very important to really identify some concrete causes that are moving them. But I wonder if the panel has other examples, because I would be very curious about this.
Sure. So I can talk about one current example, and it's a work in progress. But so I work with two organizations, and one of them is CRIN, the Child Rights International Network, and there, for years, we've been trying to figure out how do we involve children in a meaningful way in our work, right? Not do programs with them and go, isn't that beautiful what they just did, but actually allow them to have influence in our work. And so it's when we decided to make sort of climate, environment, the sort of the umbrella issue that we work under, that guides our work, that we thought, oh, hold on a minute, we understand children's rights and the convention and the legal aspects, but we don't actually know that much about climate. Turns out children know a lot more than we do. So what we did was that we actually invited, we have a group of advisors now, there's 18 or so of them who are under 18 from all over the world, and we asked them to help us develop our strategy on climate. So essentially saying, well, we're a small NGO, we're international, 12 staff. What do you think an organization like us should be doing in relation to climate? And so we worked together with them, and we adopted a climate strategy which focuses on justice. And the focus on justice, well, we don't need to go into that, and so now what we're trying to do is to also kind of put ourselves behind behind the screen, and whenever we are given a platform, that we try and put their voices forward if it's relevant and if they wish to, right? So because they actually, it comes back, I think, to the issue of intergenerational collaboration. Actually, a lot of children and young people know a lot more than their parents, because they are talking about it all the time, right? Because it's their future, or potentially lack thereof. So we are actually learning probably more from this experience than they are. But so we're trying to think, okay, what is it that we can do for them, right? And the other way is that we can provide the platform, we can give them access to institutions, or like the United Nations or other, that they might not have access to. So it's really about trying to find a way that they are supporting the work of the organization, but we are also supporting them with developing skills or opportunities that they wouldn't have. And and it's a work in progress, but this is what we're trying to do, at least from where we stand.
There's an example in Scotland. I'm not directly involved with it, so I can't speak to it in too much detail, but there's a children's parliament here, which is a kind of complement in some ways to the Climate Assembly, and the idea is to sort of draw on the views of children across Scotland from different groups, from fairly diverse areas, looking at different schools, and really try and get their views and input that awareness of what their thoughts are into the Climate Assembly process. I can't speak to it in more detail than that, but that strikes me as a really good example of what could be done at a collective level. Of course, everything depends, as with the climate assemblies in general, on how far those views actually then make it into policy, but it seems like a good start. I think Tim's question also, there's the what we could do as a society, and there's also what we can do as parents. And I think obviously the example of Greta's parents was a very good one that was made earlier, and I certainly see lots of parents supporting their children on the school strikes here, and then parents of younger children, so exactly those whose children are kind of too young to make this decision for themselves, taking part in activism themselves to try and sort of fill that gap while their children are too small to do it.
I think also fundamentally it comes down to this question of treating children as people of consequence. So, there's a political theorist called Cynthia Enloe who started this question with women and women's suffrage, and what is required to get others to take you seriously, that your voice is one of weight in the room. And, a children's parliament is fantastic because there's a recognition of the importance of participation. But when does participation become meaningful? When is it that it's more than just kind of being in the room, and thus, having your personhood legitimated by your presence versus being integral to the process itself? And I think this idea of integration is one that we're not at yet, because we think in our hearts that we do take children seriously, but there's this impulse not to, right? They're unfinished beings. There's still so much for them to learn. And so how is it that we educate ourselves to treat children as people of consequence, and not just to invite them into the room, but to actually create that space where they are integral to the process? And I don't think we've learned that yet. I'm not sure I have any great tips for doing so, except that it takes a lot of faith. It takes a lot of trust in the brilliance of our children. And also that, obviously there's no perfect parenting. There's a lot of really bad parenting, but good enough parenting is where the children kind of have the freedom to make their own mistakes and to learn. And we need to trust that their experiences generate weight, that they are thus people of consequence who should be integral to these processes.
We recently had some children coming from indigenous communities participate in one of our convenings, and it was actually very powerful. And I would agree with Veronica that many times, if we're able to really give children the space where they can express themselves on their own beliefs, we can probably learn a lot more than what we think. So I like this idea of like treating children as people of consequences, because I do think there's so much we can learn from that. I would like to start wrapping up, but I would like to ask each of you, do you have any specific concerns about what's happening in COP26, or do you have any strong ideas that we will come up with some very good commitments that will allow us to thrive on this field and topic? I'm curious to see what are your thoughts about what's happening in Glasgow and what's happening in COP26 towards creating the social justice towards children and this intergenerational solidarity that we need to really support in order to make some important changes. So if we can just start wrapping up, and please, if you want to say anything else, but I'm very curious to see your thoughts around COP26 as well.
So I guess on a positive note, it was great. I was in Glasgow marching on Saturday, and it was really sort of inspiring to see all the different groups who were there marching, including a big group of parent activists, some with their young children, but also obviously the huge youth marches that had taken place. So that was encouraging. But I guess more worryingly is what I'm seeing coming through on social media about concerns that young people have, particularly young people of colour or from an Indigenous perspective, who are feeling that they are really being shut out of the negotiations. So it seems, and the way in which civil society observers have been given very limited access to what's going on, all those kind of raise concerns. So there's a sort of positive feeling that there is this real force of opinion and determination from young people and parents, but at the same time, it comes back to what Kat was saying. I mean, how far is this actually translating, actually getting heard by the decision makers? And that's still, I think, the real concern here.
Yes, I mean, I think Greta Thunberg said perfectly a few weeks prior to COP, she was just like blah, 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 right? And I think this is when we were doing the work with children for our strategy, they were like, enough talking already, enough of it. And the other point that she made, which I think was really, really strong, was that, the media mostly reports on all the promises and the commitments that are made, and never on whether they are fulfilled. And I think this is really important. I'm a huge cynic when it comes to big conferences and events, and having gone to many where they are usually of very little consequence, and usually recommendations have already been adopted way before people show up, But not to be completely, negative, I think, it confirms what we were worried about, I guess, and it does raise people's energy levels, right? And it makes people more adamant that we have to kind of collaborate, and we have to focus on solidarity as civil society, as parents, as individuals. And I think, that's probably the best we can get out of it. And maybe, all of the kind of, I mean, I think it was problematic from the start because the United Kingdom was hosting COP, which is just, it's just such a paradox, actually a contradiction. And so that in itself was very challenging. You know, it was going to be led by the biggest polluters and the governments that, you know, lie the most and are actually mostly campaigning and pushing for isolation, not solidarity. So that in itself is a contradiction. But in terms of us, you know, activists and parents and civil society, it just has to reinforce that, you know, we need to work together. We need to collaborate.
Yeah, I think it makes it ever clearer that our governments don't represent us. I think this goes back to Veronica's point that, you know, children who are able to articulate a desire to vote and issues that they care about, you know, the fact that, you know, the world is represented by people who don't represent, who, you know, don't represent what their constituency looks like, sounds like, their age, their class, their concerns, that perhaps, you know, we're just adding to the slow drip of the need for actual revolution. Let, you know, drop the voting age to 10, change the system of representation. You know, that real radical action needs to happen, because we're essentially just getting more and more evidence, you know, from COP26 and from other recent political developments that the world is descending into oligarchy, and that's precisely the opposite of what we need to do for our children. And, you know, this should be a striking example of the fact that massive change is needed, not just more knocking on doors and asking to be included.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just say I completely agree with that. I mean, if these decisions are being made with fossil fuel lobbyists in the room and young people, activists shut out of it, then there's something incredibly wrong from a democratic point of view there.
Well, thank you so much, Veronica, Kat, and Liz. I think it's been a really good conversation. I do want to, I'm going home with some main takeaways, but I do want to emphasize on the importance of collective duty and collective action. I do want to say that for me, communicating in different ways and I'm bringing these strong stories that represent not only individual rights, but actually have this idea of collective rights is more important than ever. I do agree that we need to find diverse ways of having people who do represent us, and hopefully we can make some action and take some awareness that can really take us to those pathways that we basically can start seeing different leadership that can really convince us of making these big changes. But thank you so much for tonight's advice, and I look forward to see what's coming next from the action that parents can take, that children can take, and that we can all take to make the changes that children need in order to thrive. Thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you, everyone.